Monetary policies in all economies is implemented by public institutions called central banks. What is a central bank? Why is monetary policy implemented by a bank? In this segment, we will learn about central banks, the institutions entrusted with conducting monetary policy. The central bank acts as a banker to banks, managing the liquid reserve accounts that commercial banks use to implement interbank payments. The central bank prints currency and therefore maintains the monetary base, the liquid funds used for transactions in the economy. The central bank also acts as the banker to the government, financing the purchase of foreign reserves. After viewing this segment, you should be able to 1. Identify the two key roles of the central bank. 2. Identify the main elements of the central bank balance sheet. Let's get started. In the previous section, we were introduced to the idea of the implementation of monetary policy. Implementation is conducted by central banks using their instruments to control the available liquidity to guide the interbank interest rate to the operational target. In this section, we'll explain what we mean by liquidity. In the next video, we will define interbank interest rates. And in the third video, we will illustrate the connection between liquidity and interbank interest rates. Following that, we discuss how the instruments of monetary policy change the level of liquidity. We can then show how the central bank guides the interbank rate to the operational target. Central banks are organized as banks to play specialized roles in the financial system. Like any bank, they take deposits and make loans, hold assets and incur liabilities. However, the central bank is part of the public sector and operates to achieve policy goals rather than to make profits. The central bank is a public financial institution that plays two major roles. The central bank acts as a banker to two key constituencies, the commercial banking system and the government. The main role of the central bank is to act as the banker to commercial banks. It gets its name from being at the center of the banking system. In addition, the central bank plays a role as the banker to the government, delivering financial services to central authorities. Number 1, banker to banks. Ordinary individuals maintain deposits and checking and savings accounts at commercial banks in order to facilitate their normal market transactions. Likewise, commercial banks maintain accounts at the banker's bank, the central bank, in order to implement transactions with one another. These accounts, called reserve accounts, are critical for the payment systems of the economy. Payments between banks are necessary to implement many transactions, and these are accomplished using central bank reserve accounts. Transactions between buyers and sellers are arranged using checkings and savings accounts. Most transactions may be initiated with such deposit accounts, but are ultimately finalized with commercial banks' reserve accounts at the central bank. Let's give an example of two individuals named Ann and Bree. Ann has a checking account at Green Bank, while Bree maintains an account at Red Bank. Suppose Ann buys a car from Bree with a check. Ann takes possession of the car, and Bree receives a check from Ann. The check is drawn in Ann's bank, Green Bank. Bree deposits the check at her account at Red Bank. Red Bank then passes the check to its own bank, the central bank. The central bank transfers funds to the Red Bank from the Green Bank reserve account. Green Bank's reserve account balance shrinks and Red Bank's reserve account balance grows. In turn, Red Bank credits their depositor Bree with additional funds, while Green Bank debits Ann's account. This transaction starts with a check, but can only be completed with a transfer of funds on the books of the central bank. Another liquid vehicle used for purchases is good old-fashioned paper currency. For example, what if Ann bought the car from Bree with cash? Ann takes possession of the car, and Bree takes possession of the cash, and the transaction is finalized. Commercial banks are not directly involved in this transaction. However, the central bank is involved by issuing the currency in the first place. Thus, the central bank is responsible for providing the fundamental liquidity for buying and selling goods with either currency or banking instruments. The two fundamental channels for finalizing market transactions, currency and bank reserves, are sometimes referred to as the monetary base. The monetary base is defined as the sum total of currency in the hands of the public plus commercial banks' reserve accounts at the central bank. Both currency and reserve accounts are issued by the central bank. Thus, the basic liquidity of the economy includes the current liabilities of the central bank. Like any bank or business, the central bank has a balance sheet listing its assets and liabilities. At one time, central banks held their assets in gold or silver bullion. Today, however, central banks typically hold assets in bonds or other negotiable debt instruments. Liabilities can be split into two categories: monetary liabilities and non-monetary liabilities. Monetary liabilities are the elements of the monetary base, currency, and the reserve accounts of commercial banks. Non-monetary liabilities are long-term instruments used to finance the activities of the central bank without impacting liquidity conditions. The net worth of any institution is the difference between its assets and liabilities. Consider this detailed example of the balance sheets of the Bank of Thailand, which are measured in baht, the currency of Thailand. In November 2016, the Bank of Thailand claimed assets of almost 7 trillion baht and a similar amount of liabilities. Part of these liabilities are monetary liabilities, which provide the basic liquidity of the payment system. Most of this liquidity is currency, or basic paper banknotes plus coins. The reserve deposits of the commercial banking system are 105 billion baht. This is less than 2% of the total liabilities of the bank. In total, the elements of the monetary base together make up only about a quarter of the Bank of Thailand's liabilities. Central banks may also incur longer-term non-monetary liabilities. These include the fiscal reserves of the central government deposited at the central bank, long-term bonds issued directly by the Bank of Thailand, and long-term loans from the commercial banking system. Why does the central bank issue long-term liabilities? They do so in their secondary role as the banker of the government. Before we examine this role, stop to note the very small net worth of the bank, less than 2% of the assets of the central bank. Number 2, banker to the government. Historically, central banks were created to finance government budgets before the development of bond markets allowed the Treasury to directly raise funds from investors. Currently, though, regional economies are not so reliant on the central bank for financing the government budget. In many economies, central banks still play an important role in managing some of the financial needs of the government. In the Asia-Pacific region, central banks often manage a large portfolio of foreign currency assets called foreign reserves. Central bank assets tend to be concentrated in foreign currency assets called foreign reserves, or debt instruments issued by the domestic government. For example, the Bank of Thailand primarily keeps its assets in foreign reserves, which they classify in an accounting sense as claims on non-residents. Only a small fraction of holdings are claims on the domestic government, specifically domestic government bonds. This pattern of asset holdings is quite typical of Asia-Pacific central banks. Emerging markets are encouraged to hold an inventory of foreign currency to use to purchase imports or repay short-term debts in the event of a financial crisis. 8 regional central banks, including the Bank of Thailand, hold their assets overwhelmingly in foreign reserves. Among these economies, foreign assets make up between 70 and 95% of central bank holdings. The major exception is the Bank of Japan. The Japanese Finance Ministry holds the extensive foreign reserves of Japan rather than the Japanese Central Bank. Now that we've completed this segment, you should be able to 1. Identify the 2 key roles of the central bank, and 2. Identify the main elements of the central bank balance sheet. As we wrap up, let's conclude by summarizing the key question. Why is monetary policy implemented by a bank? The central bank makes monetary policy, but also functions as a bank. Commercial banks hold reserve accounts at the central bank, which are used for interbank payments. The central bank operates the interbank payment system, the foundation of the transactions liquidity of the economy. Commercial bank reserves and currency issuance are the central bank liabilities, which make up the monetary base. We have also seen that Asia-Pacific central banks issue large quantities of long-term debt to finance the holdings of foreign reserves.